Welcome to Put Simply, the podcast that puts what's happening in the world simply without compromising on the details. Erdem Koch is my name, Ozan and Rodney McCune, my co-hosts. Gents, wonderful to be back with you.
Good to be with you.
And a very distinguished guest this week on our podcast for the first time here on Put Simply. It's an absolute pleasure to have Mark Domitrak here. He's the Global Head of Insight and Research at CT Group. Mark, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Gents, thank you very much for having me.
And give our listeners the 15-second version of who you are, Mark.
I'm the Global Head of Research for CT Group. We're a campaigns and communications firm, global campaigns communications firm that uses our political heritage, having worked on campaigns, taking it into the corporate sector. And I think that, again, what we'll talk about today is that those skills of understanding what drives behaviour, but also how to communicate, is more and more critical in the world. And I think you've seen that very much this week.
Indeed, and no shortage of things to talk about when it comes to politics and everything that's been happening around the world. And we're going to start with the reaction of the entire world, really, not just in the US, but across definitely the Western world and indeed the entire world, to the murder of Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist who was assassinated at a university in Utah last week. Obviously, his death has seen an outpouring of emotion, particularly on the right side of politics, and then met with some angry comments from both sides of politics, and we're going to try to dissect that here on Put Simply. Mark, let's start with you. When we come to the reaction of what happened to Charlie Kirk, is there anything that's surprised you? Has it been sort of expected on both sides of politics? What's your general observations of what sort of the last 7 days has seen?
We've noticed a trend through 2025, and I think the last 7 days have very much crystallised this, and that is the old paradigm of news, where news had to be something sort of locally relevant or so big as to cut through that, is now dead. And what we're finding is that what news now is it's content. It's more content. It's driven by personalities. It's driven by influences. And it tends very much to be driven by the platforms on which that information is shared. And I think that, not getting into the politics of the events of the last 7 days, but the fact that here you had someone who was shot, but he wasn't an elected official. He wasn't sort of a head of sort of a major religion, if you like. But the media coverage brought into confluence individuals, influences as well. And as a result of that, the fact that you see something like this dominate news for 7 days, the fact that it's still an issue on Le Monde, Deutsche Welle, you go to Africa Today, the Straits Times here in Singapore, all reporting it. At a time when there are other things happening. For example, remember, this occurred when Israel had sort of just bombed Qatar. Now, under the old, if you like, paradigm of news, that would have been the dominant issue. But I think that the way people consume news, the content which people now consume on news, this has very much crystallized the rules of the game have changed.
It's a really interesting point, Mark, particularly in the context of when you have a look at the statements made by Charlie's widow, Erica Trump, who obviously said, that this is going to ignite the movement that Charlie set up, and this is going to encourage people to be part of the movement. We've seen the account of Charlie Kirk, particularly on platforms like TikTok, go 4x, 5x since his death. We've seen applications to launch Turning Point USA, the organization that Charlie Kirk founded and then ran and then grew. The number of applications across both high schools and colleges in the United States increased by 2x, 3x. We have seen, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, do an entire podcast on the Charlie Kirk show, hosting people like Robert Kennedy, the White House press secretary, et cetera, et cetera. We are seeing this outpouring of support and also an increase in interest. Rodney, where have you sort of placed what's been happening in terms of the reaction, the initial reaction and the anger, and then I guess what is happening inside the movement in the United States and around the world over the last week?
Following this has been somewhat exhausting. I always take the view that if you're going to say something publicly, the question is it helpful or is it unhelpful? and 99% of what seems to be fueling the cycle around this tragedy is incredibly unhelpful. It's been politicized as to not who the individual was who was responsible, but who motivated that individual to do this thing. And it's just a terrible reflection of where American political life is. That there's this desperation on the media so soon after a terrible event to really lean into it as a political issue. The only person, well, I'm not going to say the only person who hasn't sought to politicize. I'm sure there are a few, but yeah, I mean, it's just it's mind-boggling. Even in social media feeds that I see where the contributions are from people in the UK, they're arguing on whether woke culture caused this, whether it was the crazy left, whether it was someone further right than MAGA, and he was this chap was cross with MAGA. I mean, it really doesn't necessarily matter at this stage. What they actually need is some level of stability and a collective rejection of uh, politically motivated violence, and instead, what we're getting is a cycle of the Democrats have motivated more political violence, and the Republicans against the Republicans have motivated more political violence than the Democrats. Neither of those are particularly appealing arguments when people fail to mention, acknowledge, or criticize where things like this have happened triggered by their own side of the house. So yeah, it's pretty depressing, but not surprising. It is interesting in terms of his wife saying that she's going to continue the mission and so on, and a little bit reminiscent of Yulia Navalnaya, who who's carried on much of the Russian opposition work that was being progressed by or advocated by her husband. Maybe she now assumes a very public profile. I don't know whether that is going to be the case, and it may well be. But I've also read something today that Vance is going to take over his podcast or something. I've no idea whether that's true. Ozan probably knows that. He follows these things more closely.
Look, I haven't heard that one, but I want to pick up on a very good insight that Mark has brought in, and I think this is different. This is very much, I think, a story that has surprised me in terms of its ability to last this long and capture the attention of the world media. But I think partly or major part of that is because you have one side of the political spectrum in the US who from the first moment it happened declared war on Democrats. And I'm not even saying the radical left anymore. You have people, very, very prominent members of the right, Fox News commentators, even some elected members, who use this opportunity to declare war on effectively Democrats. So this is very disappointing. As Rodney said, I think it's doing is fueling further cycles of God forbid violence, but division. And at a time, I think we spoke about this last week, at a time when everybody should be kind of denouncing this unconditionally, regardless of who's responsible. This is a horrific act, and at a time when people should be condemning it from both sides. You have one side of politics in the US who's making it a political issue, and this is very disappointing because at the end of the day, the data doesn't back their arguments. I mean, the argument right now and the narrative that's taken hold is that somehow most of the political violence that's taking place in the US has been undertaken by the radical left, or some people claim Democrats. And the data doesn't show that. I mean, the majority of these sorts of actions that have been taken place have been, the people who've been responsible have been people with serious mental health challenges, serious, people who have, unhealthy obsessions with certain individuals. And this sort of thing doesn't, it transcends ideological borders. The person that tried to assassinate President Trump was hardly a Democrat. January 6th, while some on the right claim that this was an act of political violence, others would argue that it was probably one of the biggest acts of communal political violence that the seen in modern times. So I think we need to get away from this finger pointing, and I think the leaders in the West need to just take a step back and realize that you need to address the terrible divisions that have taken place in this country and really start to actually rebuild and unite. But I don't see much hope of that happening, unfortunately.
I think it's just picking up on Ozan's point there. The whole thing and the aftermath, the whole episode is tragic. It's a tragic course of events, and I think the danger shows what happens when you move from reporting facts and figures, as traditional reporting was, to reporting commentary. And I think the fundamental shift that we've sort of seen now with news is that a lot of it tends to become commentary rather than actual facts, rather than news, rather than the specifics. Social media, TikTok and what have you has amplified that. And I think we're probably moving towards that sort of paradigm, if you like. But it's certainly the events of the last week really show what happens when it does become comment rather than necessarily the facts.
I guess, look, that's a very good point, because I would, it would have been interesting to see if the right, particularly President Trump, had come out and unconditionally condemned this and didn't start to point fingers, etc. To Mark's point, would this have been a story that has lasted 1 week? That's a very interesting question, because I agree with you, Mark. I think if the coverage was more focused on reconciliation, trying to bring people together, facts, etc., I don't think you'd have this extensive coverage. But the media is not interested, so I think the media has a lot to answer for on this as well.
But like, the point is, it's not just exactly. It's not just the MAGA element who's going down this polarization line. Mainstream media in the US is flagging up Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber, having been the biggest cause of casualties in an episode of political violence. I mean, how does that help? Like, really, how does that help? There's already a significant base of Republicans who think everything MAGA do or the American right do is a risk to the Constitution, is a risk to democracy. And unfortunately, there's a significant base in MAGA who take the same view of Democrats. None of this is healthy. America is not a healthy place right now. And, Charlie Kirk's killing hasn't created that, but it's just shone a spotlight on it from another angle in terms of things that we observe about how a society reacts to something like this.
I think that's where the lesson there is when it comes to highly polarized situations, is not to fan it, and there's almost an obligation to those who use these platforms responsibly to try and take it out. I think, as you said earlier, Rodney, if your contribution's not going to help or if it's going to inflame it, why contribute? And I think that we've sort of got a culture with social media where it almost encourages you to do that. So that responsible use is very much needed now.
Well, I think, it's sort of indicative of where the world is at, right? You've got the extreme voices on both sides of the debate that sort of drown out the noise of anybody in the sensible center, and it's a trend that we've been seeing for quite some time, not just in this last week, but particularly in I guess in the last 10 to 15 years. Part of it's fueled by social media, part of it's fueled by the partisan nature in which we conduct our politics, particularly in the West. It's just becoming more and more divisive, I guess. And part of me wonders, was this reaction sort of inevitable because of who Charlie Kirk was, right? He obviously the leader of an incredible grassroots organization of the conservative side of politics, and someone who's incredibly close to the administration personally, particularly J.D. Vance, the Trump family, etc. He's very close with Kash Patel, the director of the FBI. The nature of who he was, of what he built, and then what happened to him, sort of broad daylight, assassination in front of all these people on a college campus, because of who he was, was the reaction, I guess, in a way inevitable. Let me put that out there.
Look, I copped some criticism after last week around, how we effectively communicated on this podcast that this was a bit of a turning point, and I'm not trying to use a pun, but I think this was a bit of an unusual event in the sense that its ramifications and its significance was grand, and I think that's partly to do with the personality. I think he was considered a significantly kind of charismatic figure who took with him, people that traditionally weren't or didn't find conservative politics all that appealing, young people, etc. He had a significant role to play in building, President Trump's winning coalition. So I think a large part of that was certainly him as a person, but I think it's also it kind of in some ways confirmed the narrative that the right and those people on the right have got or have convinced themselves of and are communicating in that they are constantly in a state of war against what they consider to be a threat to their moral standing, moral values, to their politics, to their freedoms. And look, sometimes I don't have that view, so it's hard for me to relate to it, but sometimes they may be right. But often I find that, they are at war with some, imagined enemy, particularly around, some of the kind of the trans movement or other kind of woke movement that they seem to consider as a major threat to their whole way of living and whole kind of philosophy. So this type of grievance, victimization, etc., or victim kind of mentality has been a feature of right-wing conservative MAGA politics for a very long time, and I think this feeds into that, and in some ways it's one of the biggest, I suppose, symbols of it, because Charlie Kirk played a major role in pushing this narrative forward. I mean, Charlie Kirk was constantly at war with imagined or real threats, as he would see them. So he kind of, in some ways, represented that movement, and that movement is getting more and more significant in the conservative world in the US and beyond the US as well.
Yeah, look, Erdem, I think when you look at the reaction, and I know what Ozan says is right, but and he mentioned Kash Patel, who looks so far out of his depth in his job, in his public responses to this. But in any other context, the memes that are going around about his reference to Valhalla would be super funny, you know what I mean? But it's not funny when it relates to him trying to express some sympathy in relation to the killing of someone he knew quite well. It's not that difficult as a human to find some empathy for someone who you may have disagreed with entirely politically. And Charlie Kirk, might be that case for many on the left, but you cannot simply turn his killing into some sort of joke. It's appallingly insensitive, and I know this cuts both ways, but in a sense, maybe this is wrong, but in a sense, sometimes people expect a little bit better from the Democrats, and they don't show better on stuff like this, or people on the left. Maybe the Democrats is maybe a bit unfair, but people on the left you know, they've got to show what's lacking in the other side. If their accusation that it's lacking is correct, show something different.
I think look, I'm glad you clarified that, because I think we need to clarify that it's not. I've not heard, and I'm happy to be proven wrong. I've not heard one prominent Democrat say anything but words of empathy and and conciliation and and convey their horror at this. There are idiots and stupid people that claim to be on the left, for sure, and what they're doing is despicable. But I think that we need to be we need to draw a line in the sand. This is not, declaring war on Democrats. Declaring war on Democrats is extremely, extremely irresponsible and dangerous. But you haven't seen the same rhetoric coming from the Democrats.
I think it sort of just reinforces what we were talking about earlier, how the structures of communication that we now have allow and make it easier, if you like, to have this sort of polarized discussion and provide platforms for this polarized debate. And those sort of do exactly the sort of people are talking about, those who sort of have responsibility, is how do you cut through that messaging, that extreme messaging, given everybody now has an opinion and everybody feels that their opinion needs to be heard and should be communicated. And I think the events of the last 7 days reinforce sort of the dangers of that. And the dangers of the platforms, and there's almost responsibility on the platforms to look at, well, where is it? For example, we heard there was a lot of stories afterwards that a lot of people first saw those horrific events on TikTok, and so that is now a major source of news. Looking at how you would communicate, taking responsibility, greater responsibility for your communication, now becomes all the more important.
One final point on this, Erdem, if you don't mind, the way that the debate is polarized, it doesn't matter where the evidence leads as to who's responsible. A large number of people won't accept that, and it doesn't matter where the evidence leads as to what the motivation of the person responsible is. Even if they accept who's, providing there's opinion, speculation, conspiracy to the contrary, people seize upon that rather than what the most obvious fact-based evidential explanation is. So the idea that suddenly this becomes resolved as to the individual or individuals responsible and their motivation, it doesn't. This just never ends as a cycle.
Yeah, it's a good point and a perfect segue, I think, Rodney, to what's been happening in the UK, particularly over the weekend, as reportedly up to 150,000 people attended a protest in which several police officers were injured, and a very prominent figure, the owner of X.com, Elon Musk, appeared via video link, and he told the crowd of protesters in London that violence is coming and that you either fight back or you die. Take us through the events, Rodney, and the reactions to it.
Well, it was a Tommy Robinson led, inspired, or in part fueled, I think it was called Unite the Nation, march through London, bringing together various elements in the right who've been, I'm going to say, activated by a lot of the stop the boats type stuff and anti-migration and anti-illegal migration, or whatever it happens to be. So these figures are all present in London, and then we get a great moment of insight from the Elon Musk video screen, which he's done elsewhere, of course, as well. I sort of resent the fact that he can't even be arsed to go in person to interfere with other countries' democracies. He just does it by screen. But that's a personal complaint, right? And of course, then he says that violence is coming, and you got to do something or be a victim, in effect. And yeah, deeply unhealthy. Not a great reflection on the UK. Wild differences in terms of the number of participants, from 110,000 up to 3 million. there was people doing pieces to media or camera that have now arrived on social media, and in part, of course, following what happened to Charlie Kirk, where people were calling for Starmer to be shot, people attacking immigrants in other places in the UK. When I say immigrants, these are bona fide foreign workers being told to get back on the boat, even though they've arrived by aeroplane with a proper work visa to do a job that needs to be done, usually within the health service. Yeah, it's pretty bad. Elon Musk is just so obnoxious. He must have remarkable skills to have succeeded so well in life despite his personality, I'm going to say. And nothing was interesting in what he said. I know people cheer it and so on, but it's pretty low level stuff. You know, these are really uninsightful views from platforms having brought a lot of people to central London, not to listen to very much, probably on a few tins of beer and a train ride up to London to go and dislike foreigners. I do know I did quite like the amount of social media coverage there was of protesters on their way home stopping at cultural food events to pick up onion badges and so on, which seemed to amuse a lot of people, that these right-wing protesters who wanted to return to the good old days of I don't know, pre-Anglo-Saxon Britain, and whatever their memories take them back to, still needed to get a curry on the way home. Brilliant.
And yet, Mark, what happened in London on the weekend is we're kind of seeing that around the world, right? We're seeing protests similarly in Australia, sort of on a weekly basis now. Is this a broader theme that you're seeing in your work in terms of this anti-immigration rhetoric?
Yeah, so what we are seeing, it's sort of consistent, we've been seeing it for a while now, especially in Europe. You're seeing, if you like, a quiet anger, especially amongst sort of younger people, both younger males and younger females. If you're a younger person today, even in those economies that are going well, so for example, say Malaysia or Singapore, you're more likely to be out of work than the rest of the population. If you're a younger person now, you're more likely, less likely to have a house or think you can actually aspire to getting a home. Now, you would think that not having a job and not having a home would lead you to drink. Well, they're not doing that either. So there's this quiet frustration. Then they're hearing stories about AI coming to take their jobs, and they're very concerned about what is the economy for me? What is this future for me? And so as a result of that, they don't see themselves represented in mainstream parties. That's why you saw, for example, the European elections last year, quite a strong support amongst young people for the extreme parties, be they the Greens or the extreme right. You also saw that, for example, in the recent Japanese election, where a lot of young people voted for those parties outside the mainstream. And in Malaysia, for example, you're seeing that too now with PAS. And because they're not seeing themselves represented, because they're not seeing themselves having that future that their parents and grandparents had, that frustration is leading to the sort of actions that we're seeing.
Look, I think just leading on from that, you know, as Mark touched upon, there are very angry people in society, and I think obviously the data shows that many of them are younger generation, but unfortunately, the failure of both kind of major parties around the centre, say, in most countries, in the UK, but it's the kind of failure of the moderate centre left, centre right parties to really address that anger. And when that happens, you have obviously populist movements, and you have people like Elon Musk, going out there and getting people ready to. It goes back to what I was saying around, populist movements such as MAGA and others are built on this notion that you've got to fight back against someone. So in this case, it's immigrants. In the past, it's been people who you've got to fight against, and you've got to show your anger. You've got to always maintain your rage and anger against these sort of things. And as Mark said, there are underlying economic kind of conditions that have led to this, and I think it's the failure of centre parties around the world to properly address these concerns. And I'm not saying I have the solutions, but they've vacated the field and they've left, and there's been a vacuum for some of these populist movements to come in and get traction with their populist types of views that all they do is talk about grievances, but they don't have solutions, and that's I think the clear distinction between populism and the more mainstream centre parties or moderate parties. It's very easy to kind of feed on people's grievances, get them angry, get them to fight. But we've seen with the MAGA movement, when they're in government, they're having a real tough time actually fulfilling on their promise of trying to fix the problems that they were elected to fix, because that's a key feature of populism. Very good at getting people angry, but it's not. No populist party in the history of in modern history has ever gotten into power and been able to fix the problems they were elected to fix.
I think you'll see, to Ozan's point, some of the pressure on reform now in the UK. They're in control of some councils. You actually, to Ozan's point, you have some responsibility now. You're in charge of a budget. You're in charge of local departments. You're actually now in charge of my roads and rubbish. So they now have to perform. That then becomes sort of the real telltale sign, because young people, especially in a lot of Western democracies, are going to be, if not already, the dominant voting bloc. And in a lot of these countries, demography is destiny. So these young people who are worried, concerned about their future, harnessed as voters, the forthcoming elections will be really interesting to watch.
Well, speaking of vacating the field, Lord Peter Mandelson. Rodney, tell us what's happening in the UK over this, and particularly the pressure now on Keir Starmer.
I've known Mandelson in politics for a considerable period of time, way back to when he was Northern Ireland Secretary. He's had these episodes of political difficulty where he's had to resign. There was the Hinduja issue around the passports, and there was issue around Derek Pascal was the other one, I think. Anyway, people are saying now, oh, he likes to associate himself with wealthy individuals and so on. I just feel this is very different. When he was appointed, there wasn't a huge discussion around Epstein and all these other things. But what really caused him to have to resign, because he had gone to see Epstein after Epstein's conviction, a little bit like the Prince Andrew saying that he had to go and stay for 3 days and have a guest banquet just to break off his friendship. Mandelson had gone to see him too, but what there wasn't was this level of detail about the nature of the relationship. And it's quite stomach churning, not just what he had entered in this birthday book of all the great and the good that Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell had created for him, but also then a private correspondence and emails that seemed to be between Mandelson and Epstein that I think Bloomberg released, and they were in one of the first phases of the files. And what they really, suggested was that after his conviction, Mandelson, who was then at the time in Brown's government, in effect as deputy prime minister, was going to help or encouraging him to campaign to have his conviction overturned. And it felt, on reading it, and in particular, if you didn't think that Peter Mandelson was the most amazing and so on person, this was just sort of in line with what you maybe thought of him anyway, but worse. Was that there was an indifference to the seriousness of the crimes that he had been accused and convicted of, and then he had continued to deal with him despite that. And that's really what cost Mandelson's position. He obviously resigned. He did an interview with The Sun last Monday, tried to get ahead of the story by, testing the reaction and saying there was worse to come, but in effect, confessing something so that the detail would be less newsworthy. But it didn't happen that way because it was such a big story. It's bad for Starmer because the question is being asked, or the questions are being asked, what did he know when he was appointed? What should he have known? Did he turn a blind eye to it? And then more importantly, or as importantly, when he stood up in the Commons last week and said he had confidence in Mandelson, the information had been shared the previous day with his advisor team, and it either wasn't shared with him, wasn't brought to his attention. And in fairness, the Israeli president was in the UK the previous day, so it was a pretty intense day in any event. But they allowed him to go to the dispatch box and express confidence in someone who they were seized of material, which on any view suggests he was unfit to continue. So I think that's basically the nub of it. That Mandelson's proximity to Epstein was fleshed out in a way that was quite unpleasant to read, and it cost him his job. And it's on what will not be said for Peter Mandelson at any stage now, other than every time he sought and achieved a high position, he left in scandal. It's going to be a long time before there's balance provided in terms of his significant contribution in Northern Ireland, in terms of the role he played prior to resigning and or being sacked in this occasion at a difficult time around the trade negotiations. So maybe in a longer lens or time frame, people will come back and probably review the contribution he made in a short space of time. But at the current time, his reputation's in tatters. People are saying he should never have been appointed. People are saying that we had perfectly good ambassador to the US, that Morgan McSweeney's proximity to Mandelson, he's one of Starmer's key advisors, caused Starmer to be led in the direction of appointing Mandelson despite all this baggage. And it's difficult for Starmer at a time when he's under pressure. And he's also he's not seen as someone with direction, sound judgment, and key leadership qualities. And this just sort of fuels that perception of him. I think Corbyn is now viewed by the British public of having been a better Labour leader, and that's pretty shocking.
Well, it's worth noting, I think from every election from 2010 for Labor, Corbyn got the highest primary vote, which was around 40%, whereas Labor's primary vote has always been around 34, 35%.
God help us.
His new party is called Your Party, and anytime he does an interview, you think he's responding to the person asking the questions, talking about something that they're associated with. It's really confusing.
Well, I think picking up on Rodney's point, seldom in politics is it about one issue, but tends to be a confluence of issues. I think for the Prime Minister, there was talk before about the Chancellor, then there came Angela Rayner, then there came this. It's issue upon issue upon issue, which makes it very hard to try and get some clear air or get coverage to talk about those issues that you very much want to talk about.
Yeah, and the issue around Rayner, of course, is that people in the Parliamentary Labour Party felt that he didn't do enough to protect her, but he took the hit in Prime Minister's questions to try and hold on to Mandelson, and the tsunami of information about to drop or that was becoming public, it was impossible to protect him. So there's an internal party management issue where Angela Rayner, very popular, Peter Mandelson less so, despite being effective in what he does, and that more effort was made by Starmer to protect the wrong person.
I think it also shows how quickly, to quote Boris, how quickly the herd can move, because in 2019 there was Boris with the biggest Conservative Party election since majority since 1987. Here you have Keir Starmer with, I dare think I'm right, Rodney, Labor's biggest majority, almost, or second biggest majority ever in history.
Yeah.
And you do have these machinations of, betting markets of will they still be there or not. I think it reinforces what we were talking about earlier about how quickly comment has now taken over in terms of news, and how it's not so much a news cycle, but rather a quick comment cycle that can now start to distract and take on lives of its own.
And I
Yeah,
mean,
so basically the whole system's more volatile now because of the way that social media is used.
Yeah.
And yeah, as well as its ability to unite and provide critical mass to what might other have been seen as fringe positions across a geography or a country or whatever, that these people are in contact and reassured about their fringe position because they can find other like-minded individuals.
and I mean, this is a political disaster, if you ask me, because at the end of the day, what we were referring to before, there are some serious issues that are fueling anger, not just in the UK, across the world, but serious issues in the electorate, which are really quite economic in their nature. And here you have the Prime Minister being bogged down with these sorts of scandals, whether it's Angela Rayner or now this scandal, and it feeds on that narrative that the politicians don't really care about my issues, because let's face it, I'm pretty sure most of the electorate would be disgusted by this, but at the end of the day, as is the case in the US, most of the electorate are trying to make ends meet and put food on the table. So this is yet another distraction of the leader that's supposed to be, fixing the system to help them do that. And as Mark said, that's just going to continue to put, a lot of political kind of pressure on.
Ozan, what if I say, have you read anything that's been put out by your party today?
Sorry?
You see, that's my point. This is why Corbyn's project's not going to succeed. It's so irritating that every time...
I stopped reading about Corbyn.
No, but every time he refers to your party, you say, what? I don't have a party, right?
But maybe I'm not the right person to ask, though. I mean,
no, but you know what I mean. He's saying we've released some new policies for your party. It's just really strange. And clearly they've thought that, I don't know. Anyway, I expect Corbyn not to make a great return. Maybe that's hopeful rather than reality. We'll see. Maybe the left in the UK will split in the same way that the Conservatives have split, or the right split now across Reform. And there's been another defection, of course, from the Conservative Party to Reform, and it's a single MP, but that's the first of a number that will happen as those people who are more interested in preserving their seats will move with what way they think the electoral wind's blowing.
Now
and it'll give perception of momentum behind Reform.
I'm going to go on their website and read their latest policies. You never know. Corbyn might have a convert.
And let's see the influence on this podcast in the coming weeks, given Ozan's new mission in life. Gents, it's been definitely a themed podcast around leadership politics and extreme voices on all sides. And Mark Domitrak, thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure to hear your thoughts as well.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Ozan and Rodney, great chatting with you this week. See you next.
Thank you,
Thanks,
guys.